Chapter 11. In the forests of danger and tribulation. With what joy they welcomed the shepherd as he sat down in their midst, and after cheerfully congratulating them on having surmounted the precipice, he laid his hands gently on the wounds which Much Afraid had received when she fell, and immediately they were healed. Then he began to speak to them about the way which lay ahead. You have now to go through the forests which clothe the sides of these mountains almost up to the snow line. The way will be steep, but you will come to resting places here and there. These are the forests of danger and tribulation, and often the pine trees grow so tall and so closely together that the path may seem quite dark. Storms are very frequent up here on these slopes, but keep pressing forward, for remember that nothing can do you any real harm while you are following the path of my will. It did seem strange that even after safely surmounting so many difficulties and steep places, including the impassable precipice just below them, Much Afraid should remain so like her name. But so it was. No sooner did the shepherd pronounce the words danger and tribulation than she began to shake and tremble all over again. The forests of danger and tribulation, she repeated with a piteous quaver in her voice. O shepherd, wherever will you lead me next? To the next stage on the way to the high places, he answered promptly, smiling at her as nicely as possible. I wonder if you will ever be able to get me there, groaned poor foolish little Much Afraid. I wonder you continue to bother with me and don't give up the job altogether. It looks as though I never shall have anything but lame feet, and that even you won't be able to make them like Hinds Feet. She looked disconsolately at her feet as she spoke. Certainly at the moment they did look even more crooked than ever. I am not a man that I should lie, said the shepherd gravely. Look at me, Much Afraid. Do you believe that I will deceive you? Have I said, and shall I not do it? Or have I spoken, and shall I not make it good? Much Afraid trembled a little, partly at the tone of his voice and partly because she was still much afraid by nature and was already trying to picture what the forests of danger and tribulation would be like. That always had a disastrous effect upon her, but she answered penitently, No, I know that you are not a man who would lie to me. I know that you will make good what you have said. Then, said the shepherd, speaking very gently again, I am going to lead you through danger and tribulation, Much Afraid, but you need not be the least bit afraid, for I shall be with you. Even if I lead you through the valley of the shadow itself you need not fear, for my rod and my staff will comfort you. Then he added, Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor for the arrow that fleeth by day, nor for the pestilence that walketh in darkness, nor for the destruction that wasteth at noonday. Though 1,000 fall at thy side, and 10,000 at thy right hand, it shall not come nigh thee. For I will cover thee with my feathers, and under my wings shalt thou trust. Psalm 91, verses 4-7. The gentleness of his voice as he said these things was indescribable. Then Much Afraid knelt at his feet and built yet another altar and said, Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Then, because she found that even as she spoke her teeth were chattering with fright and her hands had gone quite clammy, she looked up into his face and added, For thou art not a man that thou shouldest lie, nor the son of man that thou shouldest repent. Hast thou said, and shalt thou not do it? And hast thou spoken, and shalt thou not make it good? Then the shepherd smiled more comfortingly than ever before, laid both hands on her head and said, Be strong, be strong and fear not. Then he continued, Much Afraid, don't ever allow yourself to begin trying to picture what it will be like. Believe me, when you get to the places which you dread you will find that they are different as possible from what you have imagined, just as was the case when you were actually ascending the precipice. I must warn you that I see your enemies lurking among the trees ahead, and if you ever let craven fear begin painting a picture on the screen of your imagination, you will walk with fear and trembling and agony, where no fear is. When he had said this, he picked up another stone from the place where she was kneeling, and gave it to her to put with the other memorial stones. Then he went his way, and Much Afraid and her companions started on the path which led up through the forests. Almost as soon as they had reached the trees they saw the face of mean, sickly self-pity, looking out from behind one of the trunks. He gabbled ever so quickly before he dodged back into hiding, I say, Much Afraid, this really is a bit too thick. I mean, whatever will he do next? Forcing a poor little lame, frightened creature like yourself to go through dangers which only brave, strong men ought to be expected to face. Really, your shepherd is almost more of a bully than craven fear himself. Hardly had he stopped before Resentment put his head out and said crossly, "There's absolutely no reason for it either, because there's another perfectly good path which skirts the forest altogether and brings you right up to the snow line without going anywhere near these unnecessary dangers. Everybody else goes that way, so why shouldn't you? Tell him you won't go this way, Much Afraid, and insist on being taken by the usual path. This way is for martyrs only, and you, my dear, don't fit into the picture at all." Then Craven Fear leered at her for a moment and said contemptuously, "So you think you're going to become a little heroine, do you? And go singing through the forest of danger? What will you bet, Much Afraid, that you won't end up shrieking and screaming like a maniac, maimed for the rest of your life?" Bitterness was next to speak, and sneered from behind another tree, "He would do this. It's just as I told you. After you have dutifully gone through one terrifying experience, he's always got something still worse lying ahead of you." Then Pride, who was still limping badly and seemed extra venomous as a result, said, "You know, he won't be able to rest content until he has put you to complete shame, because that's the way he produces that precious humility he's so crazy about. He'll humble you to the dust, Much Afraid, and leave you a groveling idiot in front of everyone." Much Afraid and her companions walked on without answering and without taking any notice, but as before, Much Afraid discovered that she limped more painfully whenever she heard what they said. It was really terribly perplexing to know what to do. If she listened, she limped, and if she put her fingers in her ears, she couldn't accept the hands of her two guides, which meant that she stumbled and slipped. So they stopped for a moment or two and discussed the matter, and then Suffering opened the little first aid kit hanging at her girdle, took out some cotton and firmly plugged the ears of Much Afraid. Although this was uncomfortable, it did seem to have the desired effect, at least temporarily, for when the 5 sulkers saw that they could not make her hear them, they soon tired of bawling at her and left her alone until another opportunity should occur for badgering her again. At first the forest did not really seem too dreadful. Perhaps it was that up there on the mountains the air was so fresh and strong that it made those who breathed it fresh and strong too. Also, the sun was still shining, and Much Afraid began to feel a sensation which was completely new to her, a thrill of excitement and, incredible as it seemed, of almost pleasurable adventure. Here she was, lame Much Afraid, actually walking through the forest of danger and not really minding. This lasted for quite a time until huge black clouds gradually rolled over the sky, and the sun went in. In the distance thunder rolled and the woods became dark and very still. Suddenly a bolt of lightning scorched across the sky, and somewhat ahead of them was a rending crash as a great forest tree fell to the earth, then another and another. Then the storm in all its fury was bursting around them, thunder rolling, lightning sizzling and crackling in every direction until the whole forest seemed to be groaning and shaking and falling about them. The strangest thing was that though Much Afraid felt a shuddering thrill go through her at every crash, she was not really afraid. That is, she felt neither panic nor desire to run, nor even real dread, for she kept repeating to herself, "Though 1,000 shall fall at thy side and 10,000 at thy right hand, it shall not come nigh thee. For I will cover thee with my feathers, and under my wings shalt thou trust." So throughout the whole storm she was filled with a strange and wonderful peace such as she had never felt before, and walked between her two companions saying to herself, "I shall not die, but live and declare the works of the Lord." At last the storm began to rumble off into the distance, the crashes died down, and there was a quiet lull. The 3 women stopped to wring the water out of their clothes and hair and try to tidy themselves. As they did this, Craven Fear appeared near them again and yelled at the top of his voice, "I say, Much Afraid, the storm has only gone round the mountains for a short time. Already it is beginning to approach again and will be worse than before. Make a bolt back down the path as quickly as you can and get away from these dangerous trees before it starts again, or you will be killed. There is just time for you to make good your escape." "Look here," exclaimed Much Afraid most unexpectedly, water still dripping from her hair and her sodden skirts clinging like wet rags around her legs, "I can't stand that fellow shouting at me any longer. Please help me, both of you," and setting the example, she stooped down, picked up a stone and flung it straight at Craven Fear. Her 2 companions actually laughed for the very first time and started hurling a barrage of stones among the trees where the 5 were lurking. In a moment or two none of their enemies were visible. Then, just ahead of them, through the trees, they saw a log hut which seemed to offer a promise of shelter and protection from the storm, which certainly was again drawing nearer. Hurrying toward the cabin, They found that it stood in a clearing well away from the trees, and when they tried the door latch, to their joy it opened and they thankfully slipped inside. With great presence of mind, Suffering immediately closed the door and bolted it behind them, and none too soon. Next minute their enemies were banging on the door and shouting, "Hi! I say, open the door and let us in. The storm is starting again. You can't be so inhuman as to shut us outside and leave us to our fate." Much Afraid went to the door and shouted through the keyhole the advice they had offered her: "Make a bolt down the path as quickly as you can and get away from these dangerous trees, or you will be killed. You have just time to make good your escape before the storm starts again." There was a sound of muttered curses outside, then of hurrying feet fading away into the distance, and it seemed as though this time the advice was being acted upon. Back rolled the storm, fiercer and more terrible than before, but they were safely sheltered in the hut out of range of the crashing trees, and their shelter proved perfectly weatherproof, for not a drop came through the roof. They found in the room a supply of firewood stacked beside a small kitchen range with a kettle and some saucepans on it. While Suffering busied herself lighting the fire, Sorrow held the kettle under a spout outside the window and filled it with rainwater. Much Afraid went to a cupboard on the wall to see if it would yield any treasure. Sure enough, there was crockery on the shelves and a supply of tinned foods, as well as a big tin of unleavened biscuits. So in a very little time, while the storm still furiously raged and rattled outside, there they were, sitting around a crackling fire, warming themselves and drying their sopping garments while they drank comforting hot cocoa and satisfied their hunger. Though the uproar of the tempest without was almost deafening and the hut shuddered and shook in every blast, yet inside was nothing but peace and thanksgiving and cheerful contentment. Much Afraid found herself thinking with astonished awe that it was really the happiest and the most peaceful experience during the whole of her journey up till that time. As they lay down on the mattresses which they discovered piled in another part of the hut, she repeated again to herself very softly, "He has covered me with his feathers, and under his wings I do trust." The storm continued with great violence for 2 or 3 days, but while it lasted the 3 travelers rested quietly in the shelter of the hut, going outside only during the brief lulls to gather wood. This they dried in the oven to replenish the stock they were using, so that others, following on behind, might not be left without fuel. There seemed to be a good store of tinned foods and unleavened biscuits, and they supposed that some of the shepherd's servants must visit the hut from time to time with a new supply. During those quiet days in the midst of the raging tempest, Much Afraid came to know her 2 companions in a new way and also to understand more of the mountain dialect which they spoke. In some strange way she began to feel that they were becoming real friends, and not just attendants whom the shepherd had commanded to go with her as guides and helpers. She found, too, that now she was accepting their companionship in this way she seemed more alive than ever before to beauty and delight in the world around her. It seemed as though her senses had been quickened in some extraordinary way, enabling her to enjoy every little detail of her life, so that although her companions actually were sorrow and suffering, she often felt an almost inexplicable joy and pleasure at the same time. This would happen when she looked at the bright, crackling flames in the log fire, or listened to the sound of lashing rain overhead emphasizing the safety and peace within the hut, or when she saw through the window the tossing trees waving their arms against a background of scurrying clouds or lightning-rent sky. Or again, very early before daybreak, when she saw the morning star shining serenely through a rift in the clouds or heard the clear, jubilant note of a bird during a lull in the storm. All these things seemed to be speaking to her in the mountain dialect, and to her growing astonishment, she found it an incredibly beautiful language, so that sometimes her eyes filled with tears of pure joy and her heart seemed so full of ecstasy that she could hardly bear it. One morning when the storm was rattling and raging through the forest louder than ever, she noticed Sorrow sitting by the fire singing quietly to herself, the words, of course, being in the mountain dialect, which Much Afraid was learning to understand. This is the best translation that I can give, but you will realize that the original was much more beautiful and full of forest sounds and music. "How lovely and how nimble are thy feet, O prince's daughter! They flash and sparkle and can run more fleet than running water. On all the mountains there is no gazelle, no roe or hind, can overtake thee nor can leap as well, but lag behind." Canticle chapter 7, verse 1. "Why, Sorrow," exclaimed Much Afraid, "I didn't know that you could sing, nor even that you knew any songs." Sorrow answered quietly, "Neither did I. But on the way up here through the forest I found the words and tune coming into my head just as I am singing them now. I like it, said Much Afraid. "It makes me think of the time when I shall have hinds feet myself, and so it is comforting, and the tune is so nice and springy. It makes me want to jump." She laughed at the thought of her crooked feet being able to jump, then coaxed, "Teach me the song, please do." So Sorrow sang it over several times until Much Afraid knew it perfectly and went about the hut humming it to herself, trying to picture what it would be like to be a gazelle leaping on the mountains, and able to jump from crag to crag, just as the shepherd did. When the day came for her to receive her hinds feet, she would be able to follow him wherever he went. The picture was so lovely she could hardly wait for it to come true. Chapter 12. In the Mist. At last the storm gradually died down, the clamor on the mountains ceased, and it was time to resume the journey. However, the weather had broken completely, and though the storm itself was over, thick mist and cloud remained, shrouding everything on the heights. When they started, the mist was so thick that they could see only the trees on either side of the narrow path, and even they looked ghostly and unreal. The rest of the forest was simply swallowed up and entirely lost to sight, veiled in a cold and clammy white curtain. The ground was dreadfully muddy and slippery, and although the path did not climb nearly so steeply as before, after some hours Much Afraid found to her amazement that she was missing the rolling thunder of the storm and even the sickening crash of the trees as the lightning splintered them. She began to realize that, cowardly though she was, there was something in her which responded with a surge of excitement to the tests and difficulties of the way better than to easier and duller circumstances. It was true that fear sent a dreadful shuddering thrill through her, but nevertheless it was a thrill, and she found herself realizing with astonishment that even the dizzy precipice had been more to her liking than this dreary plodding on and on through the bewildering mist. In some way the dangers of the storm had stimulated her. Now there was nothing but tameness, just a trudge forward, day after day, able to see nothing except for white, clinging mist which hung about the mountains without a gleam of sunshine breaking through. At last she burst out impatiently, "Will this dull, dreary mist never lift, I wonder?" And would you believe it? A voice she knew all too well immediately answered from beyond the trees. "No, it won't," replied Resentment. "Moreover, you might just as well know now that this is going to continue for no one knows how long. Higher up the mountains the mist hangs thicker and thicker still. That's all you can expect for the rest of the journey." Much Afraid pretended not to hear, but the voice went on again almost at once. "Have you noticed, Much Afraid, that the path which you are following isn't going up the mountain at all, but is almost level? You've missed the upward way, and you are just going round and round the mountain in circles." Much Afraid had not exactly noticed this fact, but now she could not help realizing that it was true. They were not climbing at all, but simply moving along the mountainside with constant ups and downs, and the downs seemed to be getting more frequent. Could it be possible that they were really gradually descending the mountain instead of going up? In the bewildering mist one simply could not see anything, and she found she had lost all sense of direction. On asking her companions what they thought about it, they answered rather shortly, because, of course, she ought not to have listened to any suggestion from Resentment, that they were on the path which the shepherd had pointed out, and would certainly not allow anyone to persuade them to leave it. "But," persisted Much Afraid petulantly, "don't you think that we may have missed the way in this mist? The shepherd said the path led upward, and as you see, this one doesn't. It runs along the side of the mountain. There may easily have been a more direct way up which we didn't notice in the mist." Their only answer was that they knew better than to listen to any suggestion made by Resentment. At that the voice of Bitterness broke in quite clearly, "You might at least be willing to go back a little way and look, instead of insisting on going on and on along what may prove to be a wrong path leading you round in circles." Sorrow and Suffering took absolutely no notice, but unfortunately Much Afraid did, and said with still greater petulance, "I think you ought to consider the suggestion. Perhaps it would be better to go back a little way and see if we have missed the right path. Really, it is no use going on and on in circles, getting nowhere." To this they replied, "Well, if we are going round in circles, we shall eventually arrive back where we went wrong, and if we keep our eyes open we shall be able to see the path we missed, always provided that it does exist and is not just a bit of imagination on the part of Bitterness." "You poor little thing," came the whisper of self-pity through the mist. "It is too bad that you have been put in the charge of such obstinate mule-like creatures. Just think of the time you are wasting, getting nowhere at all. Trudge, day after day, nothing to show for it, and you ought to be getting up onto the high places." So they went on, whispering and talking at her through the clinging mist, which shrouded everything and made it all seem so ghostly and dreary. Of course, she ought not to have listened to them, but the mist was so bewildering and the path so unspeakably tame that she found something in her heart responding to them almost against her will. Suffering doggedly led the way, and sorrow just as doggedly was her rearguard, so that there was no possibility of turning back, but Much Afraid found herself limping and slipping and stumbling far more often and badly than at any other stage of the journey. It made her very disagreeable and difficult to deal with. It is true that after every stumble her conscience smote her and she apologized sorrowfully and abjectly to her companions, but that did not prevent her slipping again almost directly afterwards. Altogether it was a miserable time, and the mist, instead of clearing, seemed to get thicker and colder and drearier than ever. At last, one afternoon, when the only word which at all described her progress is to say that she was slithering along the path, all muddy and wet and bedraggled from constant slips, she decided to sing. It has not been mentioned before, but Much Afraid did not possess the gift of a sweet voice any more than a pretty face. It is true that she was fond of singing and that if the shepherd sang with her she could keep in tune and manage quite nicely, but if she tried alone the results were by no means so good. However, the mist was so thick and clammy that she was nearly stifled, and she felt she must do something to try to cheer herself and to drown the ghostly voices which kept whispering to her through the trees. It was not pleasant to think of her relatives now having the opportunity to entertain themselves at the expense of her very unmelodious voice, but she decided to risk their ribald comments. "If I sing quite loudly," she told herself, "I shall not be able to hear what they say." The only song which she could think of at the moment was the one which Sorrow had taught her in the hut, and though it seemed singularly inappropriate she lifted up her voice and sang quaveringly, "How lovely and how nimble are thy feet, O Prince's daughter! They flash and sparkle and can run more fleet than running water. On all the mountains there is no gazelle, no roe or hind, can overtake thee nor can leap as well, but lag behind." Canticle chapter 7, verse 1. There was perfect silence as she sang. The loud, sneering voices of her enemies had died away altogether. "It is a good idea," said Much Afraid to herself jubilantly. "I wish I had thought of it before. It is a much better way to avoid hearing what they are saying than putting cotton in my ears, and I believe, yes, I really do believe, there is a little rift in the mist ahead. How lovely, I shall sing the verse again." And she did so. "Why, Much Afraid," said a cheery voice close beside her, "I have not heard that song before. Where did you learn it?" There, striding toward her with a particularly pleased smile on his face, was the shepherd himself. It is just impossible to describe in words the joy of Much Afraid when she saw him really coming toward them on that dreary mountain path, where everything had been swallowed up for so long in the horrible mist and everything one touched had been so cold and clammy. Now with his coming the mist was rapidly clearing away and a real gleam of sunshine, the first they had seen for days, broke through at last. "Oh shepherd," she gasped, and caught hold of his hand and could say no more. It really had seemed as though she would never see him again. "Tell me," he repeated cheerily as he smiled at them all, "where did you learn that song, Much Afraid?" "Sorrow taught it to me," she replied. "I didn't think that she knew any songs, shepherd, but she said the words and the music came to her as we were climbing up through the forest. I asked her to teach it to me because I know I am a goose, but it makes me think of the time when you will have made my feet like Hinds' feet and I won't ever have to slither along again," and she looked shamefacedly at her bedraggled and muddy condition. "I am glad you sing it," said the shepherd more pleasantly than ever. "I think it is a particularly nice song. Indeed," he added smiling, "I think I will add another verse to it myself," and at once he began to sing these words to the same tune. "Thy joints and thighs are like a supple band on which are met fair jewels which a cunning master hand hath fitly set. In all the palace, search where'er you please, in every place. There's none that walks with such a queenly ease, nor with such grace." Canticle chapter 7, verse 1. "O shepherd," exclaimed Much Afraid, "where did you find that verse to fit in so nicely to the tune which Sorrow taught me?" Again he smiled at her in the nicest possible way and answered, "The words came to me just now as I followed you along the path." Poor Much Afraid, who knew that she had been slipping and stumbling in the most dreadful way, indeed worse than at any other time, flushed painfully all over her face. She said nothing, only looked at him almost reproachfully. Much afraid, said he very gently in answer to that look, don't you know by now that I never think of you as you are now but as you will be when I have brought you to the kingdom of love and washed you from all the stains and defilements of the journey? If I come along behind you and notice that you are finding the way especially difficult, and are suffering from slips and falls, it only makes me think of what you will be like when you are with me, leaping and skipping on the high places. Wouldn't you like to learn and sing my verse just as much as the one which sorrow taught you? Yes, said Much Afraid thankfully, and taking his hand again, certainly I will learn it and sing about the cunning master hand which takes such pains with me. By this time the mist had actually melted right away and the sun, shining brilliantly, was making the dripping trees and grass sparkle with joy and brightness. All three thankfully accepted the suggestion of the shepherd that they should sit down for a short time and rest and rejoice in the sunshine. Sorrow and Suffering withdrew a little, as they always did when the shepherd was present, leaving him to talk with Much Afraid alone. She told him all the dismal tale of their long wanderings in the mist, the way resentment, bitterness, and self-pity had been bothering her and her fear that perhaps, after all, they had wandered from the path and lost their way. Did you really think that I would let you stray from the right path to the high places without doing anything to warn you or to prevent it? Asked the shepherd quietly. She looked at him sorrowfully and said with a sigh, when resentment and the others are shouting at me I am almost ready to believe anything, no matter how preposterous. You had better become a singer, said he, smiling. Then you won't hear what they say to you. Ask Sorrow and Suffering if they have any more songs which they can teach you. Do you find them good guides, Much Afraid? She looked at him earnestly and nodded her head. Yes, very good. I never could have believed it possible, shepherd, but in a way, I have come to love them. When I first saw them they looked so terrifyingly strong and stern, and I was sure that they would be rough with me and just drag me along without caring how I felt. How I dreaded it, but they have dealt with me very, very kindly indeed. I think they must have learned to be so gentle and patient with me by seeing your gentleness. I never could have managed without them, she went on gratefully, and the queer thing is I have a feeling that they really like helping an ugly little cripple like me in this way. They do truly want to get me up to the high places, not just because it is the commandment which you have given them, but also because they want a horrid coward like myself to get there and be changed. You know, shepherd, it makes a great difference in my feelings toward them not to look upon them any longer with dread, but as friends who want to help me. I know it seems ridiculous, but sometimes I get the feeling that they really love me and want to go with me of their own free will. As she finished speaking she looked up in his face and was surprised to see that he actually looked as though he were trying not to laugh. He said nothing for a moment or two, but turned slightly so that he could look round at the two guides. Much Afraid looked too. They were sitting apart in the background and were unaware that they were being watched. They sat close to one another and were looking away up to the mountains toward the high places. Their veils had been thrown back, although she still could not see their faces because their backs were toward the shepherd and herself. She was struck by the fact that they seemed even taller and stronger than when she had first seen them waiting for her at the foot of the mountains. There was something almost indescribably majestic about them at that moment, a sort of radiant eagerness expressed in their attitude. They were talking quickly to one another, but their voices were so low that she could not catch what they were saying. Was it possible? Yes, it was. They were actually laughing. That they were talking about something which thrilled them with eagerness and expectation, she felt quite sure. The shepherd watched them for a few moments without speaking, then he turned back to Much Afraid. His eyes were laughing at her, but he said quite gravely, "Yes, I really believe you are right, Much Afraid. They do look to me as though they really enjoy their task, and perhaps even feel a little affection for the one they serve." Then he really did laugh out loud. Sorrow and Suffering dropped the veils back over their faces and looked round to see what was happening, but the shepherd had something more to say before he sped them farther on the journey. The laughter died out on his face, and very seriously he asked, "Do you love me enough to be able to trust me completely, Much Afraid?" She looked at him in the usual startled fashion so natural to her whenever she sensed that he was preparing her for a new test, then faltered, "You know that I do love you, shepherd, as much as my cold little heart is capable. You know that I love you and that I long to trust you as much as I love you, that I long both to love and trust you still more. Would you be willing to trust me?" he asked, "even if everything in the wide world seemed to say that I was deceiving you indeed, that I had deceived you all along?" She looked at him in perplexed amazement. "Why, yes," she said, "I'm sure I would, because one thing I know to be true, it is impossible that you should tell a lie. It is impossible that you should deceive me. I know that I am often very frightened at the things which you ask me to do," she added shamefacedly and apologetically, "but I could never doubt you in that way. It's myself I am afraid of, never of you, and though everyone in the world should tell me that you had deceived me, I should know it was impossible. Oh shepherd," she implored, "don't tell me that you think I really doubt you, even when I am most afraid and cowardly and despicably weak. You know I trust you. In the end I know I shall be able to say thy gentleness hath made me great." He said nothing for a little, only looked down very tenderly, almost pitifully at the figure now crouching at his feet. Then, after a time, he said very quietly, "Much afraid, supposing I really did deceive you? What then?" It was then her turn to be quite silent, trying to grasp this impossible thing he was suggesting and to think what her answer would be. What then? Would it be that she could never trust, never love him again? Would she have to be alive in the world where there was no shepherd, only a mirage and a broken lovely dream? To know that she had been deceived by one she was certain could not deceive. To lose him. Suddenly she burst into a passion of weeping, then after a little while looked straight up into his face and said, "My lord, if you can deceive me, you may. It can make no difference. I must love you as long as I continue to exist. I cannot live without loving you." He laid his hands on her head, then with a touch more tender and gentle than anything she had ever felt before, repeated as though to himself, "If I can, I may deceive her." Then without another word he turned and went away. Much afraid picked up a little ice-cold pebble which was lying on the ground where he had stood, put it in her bag, then tremblingly rejoined Sorrow and Suffering, and they continued their journey. Chapter 13. In the Valley of Loss. The mist had cleared from the mountains and the sun was shining, and as a consequence the way seemed much more pleasant and easy than it had for a very long time. The path still led them along the side of the mountain rather than upward, but one day, on turning a corner, they found themselves looking down into a deep valley. To their surprise, their path actually plunged straight down the mountainside toward it, exactly as at the beginning of the journey when Much Afraid had been led down into Egypt. All three halted and looked first at one another, then down into the valley and across to the other side. There the ascent was as steep and even higher than the precipice of injury, and they saw that to go down and then ascend again would not only require an immense amount of strength and effort, but also take a very long time. Much Afraid stood and stared, and at that moment experienced the sharpest and keenest test which she had yet encountered on the journey. Was she to be turned aside once again, but in an even more terrible way than ever before? By now they had ascended far higher than ever before. Indeed, if only the path they were following would begin to ascend, they could not doubt that they would soon be at the snowline and approaching the real high places, where no enemies could follow and where the healing streams flowed. Now instead of that the path was leading them down into a valley as low as the Valley of Humiliation itself. All the height which they had gained after their long and toilsome journey must now be lost, and they would have to begin all over again, just as though they had never made a start so long ago and endured so many difficulties and tests. As she looked down into the depths of the valley, the heart of Much Afraid went numb. For the first time on the journey she actually asked herself if her relatives had not been right after all, and if she ought not to have attempted to follow the shepherd. How could one follow a person who asked so much, who demanded such impossible things, who took away everything? If she went down there, as far as getting to the high places was concerned, she must lose everything she had gained on the journey so far. She would be no nearer receiving the promise than when she started out from the Valley of Humiliation. For one black, awful moment Much Afraid really considered the possibility of following the shepherd no longer, of turning back. She need not go on. There was absolutely no compulsion about it. She had been following this strange path with her two companions as guides simply because it was the shepherd's choice for her. It was not the way which she naturally wanted to go. Now she could make her own choice. Her sorrow and suffering could be ended at once, and she could plan her life in the way she liked best, without the shepherd. During that awful moment or two it seemed to Much Afraid that she was actually looking into an abyss of horror, into an existence in which there was no shepherd to follow or to trust or to love, no shepherd at all, nothing but her own horrible self. Ever after, it seemed that she had looked straight down into hell. At the end of that moment, Much Afraid shrieked, there is no other word for it. Shepherd, she shrieked, shepherd, shepherd, help me. Where are you? Don't leave me. Next instant she was clinging to him, trembling from head to foot, and sobbing over and over again, you may do anything, shepherd. You may ask anything, only don't let me turn back. Oh my Lord, don't let me leave you. Entreat me not to leave thee nor to return from following after thee. Then as she continued to cling to him she sobbed out, if you can deceive me, my Lord, about the promise and the Hinds Feet and the new name or anything else, you may, indeed you may, only don't let me leave you. Don't let anything turn me back. This path looked so wrong I could hardly believe it was the right one, and she sobbed bitterly. He lifted her up, supported her by his arm, and with his own hand wiped the tears from her cheeks, then said in his strong, cheery voice, there is no question of your turning back, Much Afraid. No one, not even your own shrinking heart, can pluck you out of my hand. Don't you remember what I told you before? This delay is not unto death but for the glory of God. You haven't forgotten already the lesson you have been learning, have you? It is no less true now that what I do thou knowest not now, but thou shalt know hereafter. My sheep hear my voice, and they follow me. It is perfectly safe for you to go on in this way even though it looks so wrong, and now I give you another promise. Thine ears shall hear a word behind thee saying, this is the way, walk ye in it, when ye turn to the right hand or to the left. He paused a moment, and she still leaned against him, speechless with thankfulness and relief at his presence. Then he went on. Will you bear this too, Much Afraid? Will you suffer yourself to lose or to be deprived of all that you have gained on this journey to the high places? Will you go down this path of forgiveness into the valley of loss, just because it is the way that I have chosen for you? Will you still trust and still love me? She was still clinging to him, and now repeated with all her heart the words of another woman tested long ago. Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee, for whither thou goest I will go, thy people shall be my people and thy God my God. She paused and faltered a moment, then went on in a whisper, and where thou diest, will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me. Ruth chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. So another altar was built at the top of the descent into the valley of loss and another stone added to those in the bag she still carried in her bosom. After that they began the downward journey, and as they went she heard her two guides singing softly, O whither is thy beloved gone, thou fairest among women? Where dost thou think he has turned aside? That we may seek him with thee. The shepherd himself sang the next verse, he is gone down into his garden, to the beds of spices sweet, for he feedeth among the lilies, teas there we are wont to meet. Then Much Afraid herself sang the last two verses, and her heart was so full of joy that even her unmelodious voice seemed changed and sounded as sweet as the others. So I went down into the garden, the valley of buds and fruits, to see if the pomegranates budded, to look at the vinestock shoots. And my soul in a burst of rapture, or ever I was aware, sped swifter than chariot horses, for lo, he was waiting there. Canticle chapter 6, verses 1 to 3. Considering how steep it was, the descent down into the valley seemed surprisingly easy, but perhaps that was because Much Afraid desired with her whole will to make it in a way that would satisfy and please the shepherd. The awful glimpse down into the abyss of an existence without him had so staggered and appalled her heart that she felt she could never be quite the same again. However, it had opened her eyes to the fact that right down in the depths of her own heart she really had but one passionate desire, not for the things which the shepherd had promised, but for himself. All she wanted was to be allowed to follow him forever. Other desires might clamor strongly and fiercely nearer the surface of her nature, but she knew now that down in the core of her own being she was so shaped that nothing could fit, fill, or satisfy her heart but he himself. Nothing else really matters, she said to herself, only to love him and to do what he tells me. I don't know quite why it should be so, but it is. All the time it is suffering to love and sorrow to love, but it is lovely to love him in spite of this, and if I should cease to do so, I should cease to exist. So, as has been said, they reached the valley very quickly. The next surprising thing was that though the valley did seem at first a little like a prison after the strong bracing air of the mountains, it turned out to be a wonderfully beautiful and peaceful place, very green and with flowers covering the fields and the banks of the river which flowed quietly through it. Strangely enough, down there in the Valley of Loss, Much Afraid felt more rested, more peaceful, and more content than anywhere else on the journey. It seemed, too, that her two companions also underwent a strange transformation. They still held her hands, but there was neither suffering nor sorrow in the touch. It was as though they walked close beside her and went hand in hand simply for friendship's sake and for the joy of being together. Also, they sang continually, sometimes in a language quite different from the one which she had learned from them, but when she asked the meaning of the words they only smiled and shook their heads. This is one of the many songs which all three sang down in the Valley of Loss, and it was another from the collection in the old songbook which Much Afraid so loved. I am my love's and he is mine, and this is his desire, that with his beauty I may shine in radiant attire. And this will be, when all of me is pruned and purged with fire. Come, my beloved, let us go forth to the waiting field, and where thy choicest fruit trees grow, thy pruning knife now wield. That at thy will and through thy skill their richest store may yield. And spices give a sweet perfume, and vines show tender shoots, and all my trees burst forth in bloom, fair buds from bitter roots. There will not I my love deny, but yield thee pleasant fruits. Canticle chapter 7, verses 10 to 13. It is true that when Much Afraid looked at the mountains on the other side of the valley she wondered how they would ever manage to ascend them, but she found herself content to wait restfully and to wander in the valley as long as the shepherd chose. One thing in particular comforted her, after the hardness and slipperiness of the way on the mountains, where she had stumbled and limped so painfully. She found that in those quiet green fields she could actually walk without stumbling, and could not feel her wounds and scars and stiffness at all. All this seemed a little strange because, of course, she really was in the Valley of Loss. Also, apparently, she was farther from the high places than ever before. She asked the shepherd about it one day, for the loveliest part of all was that he often walked with them down there, saying with a beautiful smile that it was one of his favorite haunts. In answer to her question, he said, I am glad that you are learning to appreciate the valley too, but I think it was the altar which you built at the top, Much Afraid, which has made it so easy for you. This also rather puzzled her, for she said, but I have noticed that after the other altars which you told me to build, the way has generally seemed harder and more testing than before. Again he smiled, but only remarked quietly that the important thing about altars was that they made possibilities of apparent impossibilities, and that it was nice that on this occasion it had brought her peace and not a great struggle. She noticed that he looked at her keenly and rather strangely as he spoke, and though there was a beautiful gentleness in the look, there was also something else which she had seen before, but still did not understand. She thought it held a mixture of two things, not exactly pity, no, that was the wrong word, but a look of wonderful compassion together with unflinching determination. When she realized that, she thought of some words which one of the shepherd's servants had spoken down in the Valley of Humiliation before ever the shepherd had called her to the high places. He had said, love is beautiful, but it is also terrible, terrible in its determination to allow nothing blemished or unworthy to remain in the beloved. When she remembered this, Much Afraid thought with a little shiver in her heart, he will never be content until he makes me what he is determined that I ought to be, and because she was still much afraid and not yet ready to change her name, she added with a pang of fear, I wonder what he plans to do next, and if it will hurt very much indeed. Chapter 14. The Place of Anointing. As it happened, the next thing which the shepherd had planned was very beautiful indeed. Not long after this conversation the path finished its winding way through the valley and led them to the foot of the mountains on the other side to a place where they rose up like a wall, far higher and steeper than the precipice of Injury. However, when Much Afraid and her two companions reached this place they found the shepherd waiting for them beside a little hut, and lo, just where the cliffs were steepest and highest was an overhead cable suspended between that spot and the summit far above. On this cable hung chairs, in which two could sit side by side and be swung right up to the top without any effort on their part at all. It is true that at first the very sight of these frail-looking aerial chairs swinging along so high above the ground made Much Afraid feel giddy and panicky. She felt she could never voluntarily place herself in one of them and be swung up that frightful-looking precipice, with only a little footrest and nothing to prevent her casting herself out of the chair if the urge should come upon her. However, that passed almost at once, for the shepherd smiled and said, Come, Much Afraid, we will seat ourselves in the first two chairs and sorrow and suffering will follow in the next. All you have to do is to trust yourself to the chair and be carried in perfect safety up to the place to which I wish to take you, and without any struggling and striving on your part." Much Afraid stepped into one of the seats, and the shepherd sat beside her while the two companions occupied the next pair. In a minute they were moving smoothly and steadily toward the high places which had looked so impossibly out of reach, supported entirely from above, and with nothing to do but rest and enjoy the marvelous view. Though the chairs swung a little in places, they felt no giddiness at all, but went upward and still upward until the valley below looked like a little green carpet and the gleaming white peaks of the kingdom of love towered around and above them. Soon they were far above the place to which they had climbed on the mountains opposite, and still they swung along. When at last they stepped out of the aerial chairs, they were in a place more beautiful than anything Much Afraid had seen before, for though these were not the real high places of the kingdom of love, they had reached the borderland. All around were Alps with grassy meadows almost smothered in flowers. Little streams gurgled and splashed between banks of kingcups, while buttercups and cowslips, violets and pink primula carpeted the ground. Clumps of delicate purple soldanella grew in vivid clusters, and all over the fields, glowing bright as gems, were gentians, more blue than the sky at midday, looking like jewels on a royal robe. Above were peaks of pure white snow which towered up into a cloudless sky like a roof of sapphire and turquoise. The sun shone so brilliantly it almost seemed that one could see the flowers pushing their way up through the earth and unfolding themselves to receive the glory of its rays. Cowbells and goat bells sounded in every direction, and a multitude of bird notes filled the air, but above the rest was one voice louder and more dominant than them all, and which seemed to fill the whole region. It was the voice of a mighty waterfall, leaping down another great cliff which towered above them, and whose rushing waters sprang from the snows in the high places themselves. It was so unspeakably lovely that neither Much Afraid nor her companions could utter a word, but stood, drawing deep breaths and filling their lungs with the spicy, pine-scented mountain air. As they wandered forward, they stooped down at every other step, gently touching the jewel-like flowers or dabbling their fingers in the splashing brooks. Sometimes they just stood still amid the profusion of shining beauty around them and laughed aloud with pure joy. The shepherd led them across meadows where the warm, scented grass grew nearly waist-high, toward the mighty waterfall. At the foot of the cliffs they found themselves standing in cool shadows with a light spray sometimes splashing their faces, and there the shepherd bade them stand and look up. There stood Much Afraid, a tiny figure at the foot of the mighty cliffs, looking up at the great, never-ending rush of waters as they cast themselves down from the high places. She thought that never before had she seen anything so majestic or so terrifyingly lovely. The height of the rocky lip, over which the waters cast themselves to be dashed in pieces on the rocks below, almost terrified her. At the foot of the fall, the thunderous voice of the waters seemed almost deafening, but it seemed also to be filled with meaning, grand and awesome, beautiful beyond expression. As she listened, Much Afraid realized that she was hearing the full majestic harmonies, the whole orchestra as it were, playing the original of the theme song which all the little streamlets had sung far below in the Valley of Humiliation. Now it was uttered by thousands upon thousands of voices, but with grander harmonies than anything heard down in the valleys, yet still the same song. From the heights we leap and go to the valleys down below, always answering to the call, to the lowest place of all. Much Afraid, said the shepherd's voice in her ear, what do you think of this fall of great waters in their abandonment of self-giving? She trembled a little as she answered, I think they are beautiful and terrible beyond anything which I ever saw before. Why terrible? He asked. It is the leap which they have to make, the awful height from which they must cast themselves down to the depths beneath, there to be broken on the rocks. I can hardly bear to watch it. Look closer, he said again. Let your eye follow just one part of the water from the moment when it leaps over the edge until it reaches the bottom. Much Afraid did so, and then almost gasped with wonder. Once over the edge, the waters were like winged things, alive with joy, so utterly abandoned to the ecstasy of giving themselves that she could almost have supposed that she was looking at a host of angels floating down on rainbow wings, singing with rapture as they went. She gazed and gazed, then said, It looks as though they think it is the loveliest movement in all the world, as though to cast oneself down is to abandon oneself to ecstasy and joy indescribable. Yes, answered the shepherd in a voice vibrant with joy and thanksgiving, I am glad that you have noticed that, Much Afraid. These are the falls of love, flowing from the high places in the kingdom above. You will meet with them again. Tell me, does the joy of the waters seem to end when they break on the rock below? Again much afraid looked where he pointed, and noticed that the lower the water fell, the lighter it seemed to grow, as though it really were lighting down on wings. On reaching the rocks below, all the waters flowed together in a glorious host, forming an exuberant, rushing torrent which swirled triumphantly around and over the rocks. Laughing and shouting at the top of their voices, they hurried still lower and lower, down through the meadows to the next precipice and the next glorious crisis of their self-giving. From there they would again cast themselves down to the valleys far below. Far from suffering from the rocks, it seemed as though every obstacle in the bed of the torrent was looked upon as another object to be overcome and another lovely opportunity to find a way over or around it. Everywhere was the sound of water, laughing, exulting, shouting in jubilation. At first sight perhaps the leap does look terrible, said the shepherd, but as you can see, the water itself finds no terror in it, no moment of hesitation or shrinking, only joy unspeakable and full of glory, because it is the movement natural to it. Self-giving is its life. It has only one desire, to go down and give itself with no reserve or holding back of any kind. You can see that as it obeys that glorious urge, the obstacles which look so terrifying are perfectly harmless, and indeed only add to the joy and glory of the movement. When he had said this, he led them back to the sunny fields, and gently told them that for the next few days they were to rest themselves there in preparation for the last part of their journey. On hearing these words, the last part of the journey, much afraid felt almost as though she would sink to the ground with happiness. Moreover, the shepherd himself remained there with them the whole time. Not for a single hour was he apart from them, but walked and talked with them. He taught them many things about the kingdom to which they were going, and it was as though grace flowed from his lips and sweet ointments and spices were diffused wherever he went. How thankfully Much Afraid would have stayed there for the rest of her life. She would have cared no more about reaching the high places, had it not been that she still walked on crooked feet, still had a twisted mouth, still had a fearing heart. It was not, however, that the sun always shone, even there on that borderland of the high places. There were days of mist when all the gleaming peaks were completely blotted out by a curtain of cloud, so that if one had never seen them it would have been impossible to be sure that they really existed and were round about, quite close at hand, towering high above the mist and clouds into the clear blue sky above. Every now and again, however, there would be a rent in the veil of mist, and then, as though framed in an open window, would appear a dazzling whiteness. For a moment one of the vanished peaks would gleam through the opening as if to say, "Be of good courage, we are all here, even though you cannot see us." Then the mist would swirl together again and the window in heaven would close. On one such occasion the shepherd said to Much Afraid, "When you continue your journey there may be much mist and cloud. Perhaps it may even seem as though everything you have seen here of the high places was just a dream, or the work of your own imagination. But you have seen reality, and the mist which seems to swallow it up is the illusion. Believe steadfastly in what you have seen. Even if the way up to the high places appears to be obscured and you are led to doubt whether you are following the right path, remember the promise, 'Thine ears shall hear a word behind thee, saying, This is the way, walk ye in it, when ye turn to the right hand and when ye turn to the left.' Always go forward along the path of obedience as far as you know it until I intervene, even if it seems to be leading you where you fear I could never mean you to go. Remember, Much Afraid, what you have seen before the mist blotted it out. Never doubt that the high places are there, towering up above you, and be quite sure that whatever happens I mean to bring you up there exactly as I have promised." As he finished speaking another rent appeared in the curtain of mist, and one of the peaks of the high places framed in blue sky shone down on them. Before the curtain closed again Much Afraid stooped down and picked a few of the gentians growing near her feet as a reminder of what she had seen, for, said she to herself, these actually grew on the lower slopes of the high places and are an earnest that though the peaks may again become invisible they are there all the time. On the last day they stayed there the shepherd did a very wonderful thing. He took Much Afraid apart by herself and carried her right up to the summit of one of the high places in the kingdom of love itself. He took her to a high peak, dazzling white, uplifted like a great throne with numberless other peaks grouped round about. Up there on the mountain top he was transfigured before her, and she knew him then to be what she had dimly sensed all along, the King of Love himself, King of the whole realm of love. He was clothed in a white garment glistening in its purity, but over it he wore a robe of purple and blue and scarlet studded with gold and precious gems. On his head he wore the crown royal, but as, much afraid, bowed herself and knelt at his feet to worship, the face that looked down upon her was that of the shepherd whom she had loved and followed from the very low places up to the heights. His eyes were still full of gentleness and tenderness, but also of strength and power and authority. Putting out his hand, without a word he lifted her up and led her to a place where on the topmost pinnacle of all they could look right out on the whole realm around them. Standing there beside him and so happy as to be scarcely conscious of herself at all, Much Afraid looked out over the kingdom of love. Far, far below were the valleys and the plains and the great sea and the desert. She even thought she could recognize the valley of humiliation itself, where she had lived so long and had first learned to know the shepherd, but that seemed so long ago it was like remembering another existence altogether. All around her, in every direction, were the snowy peaks of the high places. She could see that the bases of all these mountains were extremely precipitous and that higher up they were all clothed with forests, then the green slopes of the higher Alps and then the snow. Wherever she looked, the slopes at that season of the year were covered with pure white flowers through whose half-transparent petals the sun shone, turning them to burning whiteness. In the heart of each flower was a crown of pure gold. These white-robed hosts scented the slopes of the high places with a perfume sweeter than any she had ever breathed before. All had their faces and golden crowns turned down the mountains as if looking at the valleys, multitudes upon multitudes of them, which no man could number, like a great cloud of witnesses, all stooping forward to watch what was going on in the world below. Wherever the king and his companion walked, these white-robed flowers bowed beneath their feet and rose again, buoyant and unsullied, but exuding a perfume richer and sweeter than before. On the utmost pinnacle to which he led her was an altar of pure gold, flashing in the sun with such splendor that she could not look at it but had to turn her eyes away at once, though she did perceive that a fire burned on it and a cloud of smoke perfumed with incense rose from it. Then the king told her to kneel and with a pair of golden tongs brought a piece of burning coal from off the altar. Touching her with it he said, "Lo, this hath touched thy lips, and thine iniquity is taken away, and thy sin purged." Isaiah 6:7. It seemed to her that a burning flame of fire too beautiful and too terrible to bear went through her whole being, and Much Afraid lost consciousness and remembered no more. When she recovered she found that the shepherd was carrying her in his arms and they were back on the lower slopes of the borderland. The royal robes and the crown were gone, but something of the expression on his face remained, the look of utmost authority and power. Above them towered the peaks, while everything below was shrouded in cloud and mist. When he found that she was sufficiently recovered, the shepherd took her by the hand, and they walked together down into the white mist and through a little wood where the trees were scarcely visible and there was no sound but drops of water splashing onto the ground. When in the middle of the wood a bird burst into song. They could not see it for the mist, but high and clear and indescribably sweet the bird sang and called the same series of little notes over and over again. They seemed to form a phrase constantly repeated, always with a higher chirrup at the end which sounded just like a little chuckling laugh. It seemed to Much Afraid that this was the song the bird was singing. He's gotten the victory, hurrah! He's gotten the victory, hurrah! The wood rang with the jubilant notes, and they both stood still among the dripping trees to listen. Much Afraid, the shepherd said, "You have had a glimpse of the kingdom into which I am going to bring you. Tomorrow you and your companions start on the last part of your journey which will bring you thither." Then with wonderful tenderness he spoke words which seemed too glorious to be true. "Thou hast a little strength and hast kept my word, and hast not denied my name. Behold, I will make thine enemies to come and worship before thy feet, and to know that I have loved thee. Behold, I come quickly, hold fast that which thou hast, that no man take thy crown, and she that overcometh will I make a pillar in the temple of my God, and she shall go no more out. And I will write upon her the name of my God, I will write upon her my new name." Revelation chapter 3, verses 8-12. It was then that Much Afraid took courage to ask him something which she had never dared ask before. With her hand held in his she said, "My Lord, may I ask one thing? Is the time at last soon coming when you will fulfill the promise that you gave me?" He said very gently, yet with great joy, "Yes, the time is not long now. Dare to begin to be happy. If you will go forward in the way before you, you will soon receive the promise, and I will give you your heart's desire. It is not long now, Much Afraid." So they stood in the mist-filled wood, she trembling with hope and unable to say a word, worshipping and wondering if she had seen a vision, or if this thing had really happened. Upon his face was a look which she would not have understood even if she had seen it, but she was too dazed with happiness even to look at him. High over the dripping trees the little bird still sang his jubilant song, "He's gotten the victory," and then in a burst of trills and chuckles, "Hurrah! Hurrah! Hurrah!" A little later they were down in the meadows where Sorrow and her sister were waiting for their return. It was time to go forward on the journey, but after the shepherd had blessed them and was turning to go his way again, Suffering and Sorrow suddenly knelt before him and asked softly, "Lord, what place is this where we have been resting and refreshing ourselves during these past days?" He answered very quietly, "This is the place to which I bring my beloved, that they may be anointed in readiness for their burial." Much Afraid did not hear these words, for she was walking a little ahead, repeating over and over again. He said, "Dare to begin to be happy, for the time is not long now, and I will give you your heart's desire." Chapter 15. The Floods. The path they followed did not go straight up to the heights but sloped gently up the mountainside. The mist still shrouded everything, and indeed grew a little thicker. All three walked in silence, occupied with different thoughts. Much Afraid was thinking of the promise the shepherd so recently had given her, "Behold, I come quickly and will give thee thy heart's desire." Suffering and Sorrow perhaps were thinking of the answer they had received to the question asked of him at parting. Whether or not this was so there was no indication, for they walked in complete silence, though the help they gave their lame companion was, had she noticed it, even more gentle and untiring than before. Toward evening they came to another log cabin standing at the side of the path with the shepherd's secret mark inscribed upon the door, so they knew that they were to rest there for the night. Once inside they noticed that someone must have been there quite recently, for a fire was burning brightly on the hearth and a kettle of water was singing on the hob. The table, too, was laid for three, and a supply of bread and fruit upon it. Evidently their arrival had been expected and these kindly preparations made, but of the one who had thus gone in the way before them there was no sign. They washed themselves and then sat down at the table, gave thanks, and ate of the prepared meal. Then, being weary, they lay down to rest and immediately fell asleep. How long she had slept Much Afraid could not tell, but she woke suddenly while it was still quite dark. Her companions slumbered peacefully beside her, but she knew that someone had called her. She waited in silence, then a voice said, "Much Afraid." "Behold me, here I am, my lord," she answered. "Much Afraid," said the voice, "take now the promise you received when I called you to follow me to the high places, and take the natural longing for human love which you found already growing in your heart when I planted my own love there and go up into the mountains to the place that I shall show you. Offer them there as a burnt offering unto me." There was a long silence before Much Afraid's trembling voice spoke through the darkness. "My lord, am I understanding you right?" "Yes," answered the voice. "Come now to the entrance of the hut and I will show you where you are to go." Without waking the two beside her, she rose silently, opened the door of the hut, and stepped outside. Everything was still shrouded in mist, and the mountains were completely invisible, swallowed up in darkness and cloud. As she looked, the mist parted in one place and a little window appeared through which the moon and one star shone brightly. Just below them was a white peak, glimmering palely. At its foot was the rocky ledge over which the great waterfall leaped and rushed down to the slopes below. Only the lip of rock over which it poured itself was visible, all below being shrouded in the mist. Then came the voice, "That is the appointed place." Much Afraid looked, and replied, "Yes, Lord. Behold me, I am thy handmaiden, I will do according to thy word." She did not lie down again, but stood at the door of the hut waiting for daybreak. It seemed to her that the voice of the fall now filled the whole night and was thundering through her trembling heart, reverberating and shouting through every part and repeating again and again, "Take now the promise that I gave you, and the natural human love in your heart, and offer them for a burnt offering." With the first glimmer of dawn she bent over her sleeping companions and said, "We must start at once. I have received commandment to go up to the place where the great fall pours itself over the precipice." They rose immediately, and after hurriedly eating a meal to strengthen themselves, they started on their way. The path led straight up the mountainside toward the thunderous voice of the fall, though everything was still shrouded in mist and cloud and the fall itself remained invisible. As the hours passed they continued to climb, though the path was now steeper than ever before. In the distance thunder began to roll and flashes of lightning rent the veil of mist. Suddenly, higher up on the path, they heard the sound of running feet, slipping and scraping on the rocks and stones. They stopped and pressed themselves closely to one side of the narrow path to allow the runners to pass. Then out of the ghostly mist appeared first fear, then bitterness, followed by resentment, pride, and self-pity. They were running as though for their lives, and as they reached the three women they shouted, "Back! Turn back at once! The avalanches are falling ahead, and the whole mountainside is shaking as though it will fall too. Run for your lives!" Without waiting for an answer, they clattered roughly past and fled down the mountainside. "What are we to do?" asked Suffering and Sorrow, apparently at a loss for the very first time. "Shall we turn back to the hut and wait until the avalanches and the storm are over?" "No," said Much Afraid in a low, steady voice, speaking for the first time since she had called them to rise and follow her. "No, we must not turn back. I have received a commandment to go up to the place where the great fall pours over the rock." Then the voice spoke close at hand. "There is a place prepared for you here beside the path. Wait there until the storm is over." In the rocky wall beside them was a little cave so low that it could be entered only if they stooped right down, and with just enough room for them to crouch inside. Side by side, they sat huddled together, then all of a sudden the storm burst over them in frightful fury. The mountains reverberated with thunder and with the sound of falling rocks and great avalanches. The lightning flashed incessantly and ran along the ground in sizzling flames. Then the rains descended and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon the mountains until everything around them seemed to be shivering and quaking and falling. Flood waters rushed down the steep cliffs and a torrent poured over the rocks which projected over the cave so that the whole entrance was closed with a waterfall, but not a single drop fell inside the cave where the three sat together on the ground. After they had been there for some time and the storm, far from abating, seemed to be increasing in strength, Much Afraid silently put her hand in her bosom and drew out the leather bag which she always carried. Emptying the little heap of stones and pebbles into her lap, she looked at them. They were the memorial stones from all the altars which she had built along the way, from the time that she stood beside the shepherd at the pool and allowed him to plant the thorn in her heart, and all along the journey until that moment of crouching in a narrow cave upon which the whole mountain seemed to be ready to topple. Nothing was left to her but a command to offer up the promise on which she had staked her all, on the strength of which she had started on the journey. She looked at the little pile in her lap and asked herself dully, "Shall I throw them away? Were they not all worthless promises which he gave me on the way here?" Then with icy fingers she picked up the first stone and repeated the first words that he had spoken to her beside the pool. "I will make thy feet like hinds' feet and set thee upon thine high places." Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 19. She held the stone in her hand for a long time, then said slowly, "I have not received hinds' feet, but I am on higher places than ever I imagined possible, and if I die up here, what does it matter? I will not throw it away." She put the stone back in the bag, picked up the next and repeated, "What I do thou knowest not now, but thou shalt know hereafter." John chapter 13, verse 7, and she gave a little sob and said, "Half at least of that is true, and who knows whether the other half is true or not, but I will not throw it away." Picking up the third stone, she quoted, "This is not unto death, but for the glory of God." John chapter 11, verse 4. "Not unto death," she repeated, "even though he says, 'Offer the promise as a burnt offering.'" But she dropped the stone back into the bag and took the fourth. "Bread corn is bruised, but no one crushes it forever." Isaiah chapter 28, verse 28. "I cannot part with that," she said, replaced it in the bag, and took the fifth. "Cannot I do with you as the potter? Saith the Lord." Jeremiah chapter 18, verse 6. "Yes," said she, and put it back into the bag. Taking the sixth, she repeated, "O thou afflicted, tossed with tempest, and not comforted, behold, I will lay thy stones with fair colors." Isaiah chapter 54, verse 11, then could go no farther but wept bitterly. "How could I part with that?" she asked herself, and she put it in the bag with the others, and took the seventh. "My sheep hear my voice, and they follow me." John chapter 10, verse 27. "Shall I not throw this one away?" she asked herself. "Have I really heard his voice, or have I been deceiving myself all the time?" Then as she thought of his face when he gave her that promise, she replaced it in the bag, saying, I will keep it. How can I let it go? And took the 8th. Now shalt thou see what I will do. Exodus chapter 6, verse 1. Remembering the precipice which had seemed so terribly impossible and how he had brought her to the top, she put the stone with the others and took the 9th. God is not a man, that he should lie, doth he said, and shall he not do it? Or hath he spoken, and shall he not make it good? Numbers chapter 23, verse 19. For a very long time she sat trembling with that stone in her hand, but in the end she said, I have already given the only answer possible when I told him, if thou canst, thou mayest deceive me. Then she dropped the icy-cold little pebble into the bag and took the 10th. Thine ears shall hear a word behind thee, saying, This is the way, walk ye in it, when ye turn to the right hand, and when ye turn to the left. Isaiah chapter 30, verse 21. At that she shuddered, but after a while added, Thou hast a little strength, and hast not denied my name. Hold that fast which thou hast, that no man take thy crown. Revelation chapter 3, verses 8 and 11. Returning the 10th stone to the bag, after a long pause she picked up an ugly little stone lying on the floor of the cave and dropped it in beside the other 10, saying, Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. Job chapter 13, verse 15. Tying up the bag again, she said, Though everything in the world should tell me that they are worthless, yet I cannot part with them, and put the bag once again in her bosom. Sorrow and her sister had been sitting silently beside her watching intently as she went over the little heap of stones in her lap. Both gave a strange laugh, as though of relief and thankfulness, and said together, The rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat upon the house, and it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock. Matthew chapter 7, verse 25. By this time, the rain had ceased, the cataract was no longer pouring over the rocks, and only a light mist remained. The rolling of the thunder and the roar of the avalanches were fading away into the distance, and as they looked out of the cave, up from the depths beneath came through the wreaths of mist the clear, jubilant notes of a bird. It might have been brother to that which sang in the dripping woods at the foot of the high places, He's gotten the victory, hurrah! He's gotten the victory, hurrah! As the pure clear notes came floating up to them, the icy coldness in the heart of Much Afraid broke, then melted away. She pressed her hands convulsively against the little bag of stones as though it contained priceless treasure which she had thought lost, and said to her companions, The storm is over. Now we can go on our way. From that place on, it was very steep going, for the path now went straight up the mountainside, so straight and steep that often Much Afraid could hardly do more than crawl forward on hands and knees. All along she had hoped that the higher she went and the nearer she got to the high places, the stronger she would become and the less she would stumble. But it was quite otherwise. The higher they went, the more conscious she was that her strength was leaving her, and the weaker she grew, the more she stumbled. She could not help dimly realizing that this was not the case with her companions. The higher they went, the more vigorous and strong they seemed to become, and this was good, because often they had almost to carry Much Afraid, for she seemed utterly spent and exhausted. Because of this they made very slow progress indeed. On the second day they came to a place where a little hollow in the mountainside formed a tiny plateau. Here a spring bubbled out of the cliff and trickled across the hollow and down the side of the mountain in a little waterfall. As they paused to rest, the voice said to Much Afraid, Drink of the brook at the side of the way and be strengthened. Stooping down at the spring where it bubbled up from between the rocks, she filled her mouth with the water, but as soon as she swallowed it she found it so burning and bitter that her stomach rejected it altogether and she was unable to retain it. She knelt by the spring, gasping for a moment, and then said very quietly and softly through the silence, My Lord, it is not that I will not, but that I cannot drink of this cup. There is a tree growing beside this spring of Mara, answered the voice. Break off a piece of branch, and when you have cast it into the waters they will be sweetened. Much Afraid looked on the other side of the spring and saw a little stunted thorn tree with but one branch growing on either side of the splintered trunk, like the arms of a cross. They were covered all over with long, sharp spines. Suffering stepped forward, broke off a piece of the thorn tree, and brought it to Much Afraid, who took it from her hand and cast it into the water. On doing this she stooped her head again to drink. This time she found that the stinging, burning bitterness was gone, and though the water was not sweet, she could drink it easily. She drank thirstily and found that it must have contained curative properties, for almost at once she was wonderfully refreshed and strengthened. Then she picked up her 12th and last stone there beside the water of Mara and put it into her bag. After they had rested a little while, she was able to resume the journey, and for a time was so much stronger that although the way was even steeper than before, she was not nearly so faint and exhausted. This greatly comforted her, for by that time she had only one desire in her heart, to reach the place appointed and fulfill the command which had been given her before her strength ebbed away altogether. On the third day, they lifted up their eyes and saw the place afar off, the great rock cliff and the waterfall, and continuing up the rocky path, at midday they came through the shrouding mist to the place which had been appointed. Chapter 16. Grave on the Mountains. The path led forward to the edge of a yawning chasm, then stopped dead. This grave-like gorge yawned before them in each direction as far as they could see, completely cutting off all further progress. It was so filled with cloud and mist that they could not see how deep it was, nor could they see across to the other side, but spread before them like a great gaping grave, waiting to swallow them up. For a moment Much Afraid wondered whether this could be the place, after all, but as they halted on the edge of the canyon, they could plainly hear the sound of mighty, swirling waters, and she realized that they must be standing somewhere near the lip of the great fall and that this was indeed the place appointed. Looking at her companions, she asked quietly, "What must we do now? Can we jump across to the other side?" "No," they said, "it would be impossible." "What, then, are we to do?" she asked. "We must leap down into the canyon," was the answer. "Of course," said Much Afraid at once. "I did not realize at first, but that is the thing to do." Then for the last time on that journey, though she did not know it at the time, she held out her hand to her two companions that they might help her. By this time she was so weak and exhausted that instead of taking her hands, they came close up to her and put their hands beneath her arms so that she leaned with her full weight against them. Thus, with suffering and sorrow supporting her, Much Afraid cast herself down into the yawning grave. The place into which they had thrown themselves was deep, and had she been alone she must have been badly hurt by the fall. However, her companions were so strong that the jump did not seem to harm them at all, and they bore her so easily between them and broke the fall so gently that she was no more than bruised and shaken. Then, because the canyon was so filled with mist and cloud that nothing was visible, they began to feel their way slowly forward and saw, looming up before them, a flat, oblong rock. On reaching it, they found it to be some kind of stone altar with the indistinct figure of someone standing behind it. "This is the place," said Much Afraid quietly. "This is where I am to make my offering." She went up to the altar and knelt down. "My lord," she said softly through the mist, "will you come to me now and help me to make my burnt offering as you have commanded me?" But for the first time on all that journey there seemed to be no answer at all, and the shepherd did not come. She knelt there quite alone in the cold, clammy mist, beside the desolate altar in this valley of shadow, and into her mind came the words which bitterness had flung at her long before when she walked the shores of loneliness. "Sooner or later, when he gets you up on the wild places of the mountains, he will put you on some sort of a cross and abandon you to it." It seemed that in a way bitterness had been right, thought Much Afraid to herself, only he had been too ignorant to know and she too foolish at that time to understand that in all the world only one thing really mattered, to do the will of the one she followed and loved, no matter what it involved or cost. Strangely enough, as she knelt there by the altar, seemingly abandoned at that last tremendous crisis, there was no sign or sound of the presence of her enemies. The grave up on the mountains is at the very edge of the high places and beyond the reach of pride and bitterness and resentment and self-pity, yes, and of fear too, as though she were in another world altogether, for they can never cast themselves down into that grave. She knelt there feeling neither despair nor hope. She knew now without a shadow of doubt that there would be no angel to call from heaven to say that the sacrifice need not be made, and this knowledge caused her neither dread nor shrinking. She felt nothing but a great stillness in which only one desire remained, to do that which he had told her, simply because he had asked it of her. The cold, dull desolation which had filled her heart in the cave was gone completely. One flame burned there steadily, the flame of concentrated desire to do his will. Everything else had died down and fallen into ashes. After she had waited for a little and still he had not come, she put out her hand and with one final effort of failing strength grasped the natural human love and desire growing in her heart and struggled to tear them out. At the first touch it was as though anguish pierced through her every nerve and fiber, and she knew with a pang almost of despair that the roots had wound and twined and thrust themselves into every part of her being. Though she put forth all her remaining strength in the most desperate effort to wrench them out, not a single rootlet stirred. For the first time she felt something akin to fear and panic. She was not able to do this thing which he had asked of her. Having reached the altar at last, she was powerless to obey. Turning to those who had been her guides and helpers all the way up the mountains, she asked for their help, and for them to do what she could not for herself, to tear the plant out of her heart. For the first time suffering and sorrow shook their heads. "We have done all that we can for you," they answered, "but this we cannot do." At that the indistinct figure behind the altar stepped forward and said quietly, "I am the priest of this altar, I will take it out of your heart if you wish." Much afraid turned toward him instantly. "Oh, thank you," she said. "I beg you to do so." He came and stood beside her, his form indistinct and blurred by the mist, and then she continued entreatingly, "I am a very great coward. I am afraid that the pain may cause me to try to resist you. Will you bind me to the altar in some way so that I cannot move? I would not like to be found struggling while the will of my Lord is done." There was complete silence in the cloud-filled canyon for a moment or two, then the priest answered, "It is well said. I will bind you to the altar." Then he bound her hand and foot. When he had finished, Much Afraid lifted her face toward the high places which were quite invisible and spoke quietly through the mist. "My Lord, behold me, here I am, in the place thou didst send me to, doing the thing thou didst tell me to do, for where thou diest, will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me." Ruth chapter 1, verse 17. Still there was silence, a silence as of the grave, for indeed she was in the grave of her own hopes and still without the promised Hinds Feet, still outside the high places with even the promise to be laid down on the altar. This was the place to which the long, heartbreaking journey had led her. Yet just once more before she laid it down on the altar, Much Afraid repeated the glorious promise which had been the cause of her starting for the high places. "The Lord God is my strength, and he will make my feet like hinds' feet, and he will make me to walk upon mine high places. To the chief singer on my stringed instruments." Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 19. The priest put forth a hand of steel, right into her heart. There was a sound of rending and tearing, and the human love, with all its myriad rootlets and fibers, came forth. He held it for a moment and then said, "Yes, it was ripe for removal, the time had come. There is not a rootlet torn or missing." When he had said this, he cast it down on the altar and spread his hands above it. There came a flash of fire which seemed to rend the altar. After that, nothing but ashes remained, either of the love itself, which had been so deeply planted in her heart, or of the suffering and sorrow which had been her companions on that long, strange journey. A sense of utter, overwhelming rest and peace engulfed Much Afraid. At last, the offering had been made and there was nothing left to be done. When the priest had unbound her, she leaned forward over the ashes on the altar and said with complete thanksgiving, "It is finished." Then, utterly exhausted, she fell asleep. Part 2. Joy cometh in the morning, Psalm chapter 30, verse 5. Chapter 17. Healing streams. When at last Much Afraid awoke, the sun was high in the sky, and she looked out through the mouth of the cave in which she found herself lying. Everything was shimmering in a blaze of radiant sunshine which burnished every object with glory. She lay still a little longer, collecting her thoughts and trying to understand where she was. The rocky cave into which the sunbeams were pouring was warm and quiet and drenched with the sweet perfume of spikenard, frankincense, and myrrh. This perfume, she gradually realized, was emanating from the wrappings which covered her. She gently pushed back the folds, sat up, and looked about her. Then the memory of all that had happened returned to her. She and her two companions had come to a cloud-filled canyon high up on the mountains and to an altar of sacrifice, and the priest had wrenched out of her heart her flower of human love and burned it on the altar. On remembering that, she glanced down at her breast and saw it was covered with a cloth soaked in the spices whose perfume stole out and filled the cave with sweetness. She pushed the cloth aside a little curiously and was astonished to find no trace of a wound, not even a scar, nor was there any hint of pain or aching or stiffness anywhere in her body. Rising quietly, she went outside, then stood still and looked about her. The canyon, which had been so shrouded in mist that nothing had been distinguishable, now shimmered in the golden sunlight. Soft, verdant grass grew everywhere, starred with gentians and other little jewel-like flowers of every variety. There were banks of sweet-smelling thyme, moss, and myrtle along the sides of the rocky walls, and everything sparkled with dew. In the center of the canyon, at a little distance from the cave, was the long stone altar to which she had been bound, but in the sunlight she saw that the flowers and mosses grew all about it and clothed its sides with verdure. Little birds hopped about here and there, scattering the dewdrops off the grasses and chirping merrily as they preened their plumage. One was perched on the altar itself, its little throat throbbing as it trilled forth a song of joy, but the most beautiful and wonderful thing of all was that out from under the rock altar there gushed a great river of water, clear as crystal. It then flowed in a series of cascades and through rock pools right through the canyon till it came to a broad lip of rock, over which it poured with a noise of shouting and tumultuous gladness. She was at the very source of the great fall and knew now that it flowed from under the altar to which the priest had bound her. For some time she stood looking about her, her heart leaping and thrilling with a growing joy which was beyond her understanding and a peace indescribably sweet which seemed to enfold her. She was quite alone in the canyon. There were no signs of her companion's sorrow and suffering nor of the priest of the altar. The only things which breathed and moved in the canyon beside herself were the cheerful little chirping birds and the insects and butterflies flitting among the flowers. High overhead was a cloudless sky, against which the peaks of the high places shone dazzlingly white. The first thing she did, after she had taken in her surroundings, was to step toward the river which gushed out from under the altar. It drew her irresistibly. She stooped down when she got to the bank and dabbled her fingers in the crystal water. It was icy cold, but it sent a shock of ecstasy tingling through her body, and without further delay she put off the white linen robe she was wearing and stepped into one of the rocky pools. Never had she experienced anything so delicious and exhilarating. It was like immersing herself in a stream of bubbling life. When at last she again stepped out of the pool she was immediately dry and tingling from head to foot with a sense of perfect well-being. As she stood on the mossy bank by the pool she happened to glance down and noticed for the first time that her feet were no longer the crooked, ugly things which they always had been, but were straight feet, perfectly formed, shining white against the soft green grass. Then she remembered the healing streams of which the shepherd had spoken, which gushed out of the ground on the high places. Stepping straight back into the pool with a shock of sweetest pleasure and putting her head beneath the clear waters, she splashed them about her face. Then she found a little pool among the rocks, still and clear as a mirror. Kneeling down, she looked into its unruffled surface and saw her face quite clearly. It was true, the ugly, twisted mouth had vanished and the face she saw reflected back by the water was as relaxed and perfect as the face of a little child. After that she began to wander about the canyon and noticed wild strawberries and blueberries and other small berries growing on the banks. She found a handful of these as refreshing and sustaining a meal as ever she had eaten. Then she came to the lip of the rock cliff over which the river cast itself, and stood a long time watching the water as it leaped over the edge with the noise of its tumultuous joy drowning every other sound. She saw how the sun glorified the crystal waters as they went swirling downward, and far below she saw the green Alps where the shepherd had led her and where they had stood at the foot of this same fall. She felt completely encompassed by peace, and a great inner quietness and contentment drowned every feeling of curiosity, loneliness and anticipation. She did not think about the future at all. It was enough to be there in that quiet canyon, hidden away high up in the mountains with the river of life flowing beside her, and to rest and recover herself after the long journey. After a little she lay down on a mossy bank and slept, and when she woke again, bathed herself in the river. So the long, quiet day passed like a sweet dream while she rested and bathed and refreshed herself at intervals with the berries and then slept again. When at last the shadows lengthened and the sun sank in the west and the snow peaks glowed glorious in rose and flame color, she went back into the cave, laid herself down among the spice-perfumed coverings and slept as deeply and dreamlessly as she had the first night when the priest laid her there to rest. Chapter 18. Hinds Feet. On the third day, while it was still almost dark, she woke suddenly, and sprang to her feet with a shock of joy tingling through her. She had not heard her name called, had not even been conscious of a voice, yet she knew that she had been called. Some mysterious, poignantly sweet summons had reached her, a summons which she knew instinctively she had been awaiting ever since she woke up for the first time in the cave. She stepped outside into the fragrant summer night. The morning star hung low in the sky, and in the east the first glimmer of dawn appeared. From somewhere close at hand a solitary bird uttered one clear, sweet note, and a light breeze stirred over the grasses. Otherwise there was no sound save the voice of the great waterfall. Then it came again, tingling through her, a call ringing down from some high place above. Standing there in the pale dawn, she looked eagerly around. Every nerve in her body surged with desire to respond to the call, and she felt her feet and legs tingling with an almost irresistible urge to go bounding up the mountains. But where was the way out of the canyon? The walls seemed to rise smooth and almost perpendicular on all sides, except at the end, which was blocked by the waterfall. Then, as she stood straining every nerve to find a possible means of exit, up from a nearby mossy bank sprang a mountain hart with the hind close behind him, just as she had seen them at the foot of the great precipice of injury. As she watched, the hart sprang onto the altar of rock, and from there with a great leap he reached a projecting ledge on the wall on the farther side of the ravine. Then, closely followed by the hind, he began springing up the great wall of the canyon. Much afraid, did not hesitate one instant. In a moment she was on the rock altar herself. The next, with a flying leap, she, too, reached the ledge on the wall. Then, using the same footholds as the hart and the hind, leaping and springing in a perfect ecstasy of delight, she followed them up the cliff, the hooves of the deer ringing on the rocks before her like little silver hammers. In a moment or two all three were at the top of the canyon, and she was leaping up the mountainside toward the peak above, from which the summons had come. The rosy light in the east brightened, the snow on the summits of the mountains caught the glow and flushed like fire, and as she skipped and jumped from rock to rock excitedly the first sunbeams streamed over the mountain top. He was there, standing on the peak, just as she had known he would be, strong and grand and glorious in the beauty of the sunrise, holding out both hands and calling to her with a great laugh, "You, with the Hinds Feet, jump over here." She gave one last flying spring, caught his hands and landed beside him on the topmost peak of the mountain. Around them in every direction towered other and greater ranges of snow mountains, whose summits soared into the sky higher than her sight could follow them. He was crowned, and dressed in royal robes, just as she had seen him once before when he had carried her up to the high places, and had touched her with the live coal from off the golden altar of love. Then his face had been stern in its majesty and gravity, now it was alight with glory of joy which excelled anything which she had ever imagined. "At last," he said, as she knelt speechless at his feet, "at last you are here and the night of weeping is over and joy comes to you in the morning." Then, lifting her up, he continued, "This is the time when you are to receive the fulfillment of the promises. Never am I to call you much afraid again." At that he laughed again and said, "I will write upon her a new name, the name of her God. The Lord God is a sun and shield, the Lord will give grace and glory, no good thing will he withhold from them that walk uprightly." Psalm chapter 84, verse 11. "This is your new name," he declared. "From henceforth you are grace and glory." Still she could not speak, but stood silent with joy and thanksgiving and awe and wonder. Then he went on, "Now for the flower of love and for the promise that when it blooms you will be loved in return." Grace and glory spoke for the first time. "My Lord and King," she said softly, "there is no flower of love to bloom in my heart. It was burned to ashes on the altar at thy command." "No flower of love," he repeated, and laughed again so gently and joyfully that she could hardly bear it. "That is strange, grace and glory. How, then, did you get here? You are right on the high places, in the kingdom of love itself. Open your heart and let us see what is there." At his word she laid bare her heart, and out came the sweetest perfume she had ever breathed and filled all the air around them with its fragrance. There in her heart was a plant whose shape and form could not be seen because it was covered all over with pure white, almost transparent blooms, from which the fragrance poured forth. Grace and Glory gave a little gasp of wonder and thankfulness. "How did it get there, my Lord and King?" she exclaimed. "Why, I planted it there myself," was his laughing answer. "Surely you remember, down there by the sheep pool in the Valley of Humiliation, on the day that you promised to go with me to the high places. It is the flower from the thorn-shaped seed. Then, my lord, what was the plant which the priest tore out of my heart when I was bound to the altar? Do you remember, Grace and Glory, when you looked into your heart beside the pool, and found that my kind of love was not there at all, only the plant of longing to be loved. She nodded wonderingly. That was the natural human love which I tore out from your heart when the time was ripe and it was loose enough to be uprooted altogether so that the real love could grow there alone and fill your whole heart. You tore it out, she repeated slowly and wonderingly, and then, oh my lord and king, were you the priest? Were you there all the time, when I thought you had forsaken me? He bowed his head and she took his hands in hers, the scarred hands which had sown the thorn-shaped seed in her heart, and the hands with the grasp of steel which had torn out that love which had been the cause of all her pain, and kissed them while tears of joy fell on them. And now for the promise, said he, that when love flowers in your heart you shall be loved again. Taking her hand in his, he said, Behold, I have set my love upon thee and thou art mine, yea, I have loved thee with an everlasting love, therefore with loving kindness have I drawn thee. Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 3. After that he said, Give me the bag of stones of remembrance that you have gathered on your journey, grace and glory. She took it out and passed it to him, and then he bade her hold out her hands. On doing so, he opened the little purse and emptied the contents into her hands. Then she gasped again with bewilderment and delight, for instead of the common, ugly stones she had gathered from the altars along the way, there fell into her hands a heap of glorious, sparkling jewels, very precious and very beautiful. As she stood there, half dazzled by the glory of the flashing gems, she saw in his hand a circlet of pure gold. O thou who wast afflicted, tossed with tempest and not comforted, he said, Behold, I lay thy stones with fair colors. First he picked out of her hand one of the biggest and most beautiful of the stones, a sapphire, shining like the pavement of heaven, and set it in the center of the golden circlet. Then, taking a fiery, blood-red ruby, he set it on one side of the sapphire and an emerald on the other. After that he took the other stones, 12 in all, and arranged them on the circlet, then set it upon her head. At that moment Grace and Glory remembered the cave in which she had sheltered from the floods, and how nearly she had succumbed to the temptation to discard as worthless those stones which now shone with glory and splendor in the crown upon her head. She remembered, too, the words which had sounded in her ears and had restrained her, Hold fast that thou hast, that no man take thy crown. Supposing she had thrown them away, had discarded her trust in his promises, had gone back on her surrenders to his will, there could have been no jewels now to his praise and glory, and no crown for her to wear. She marveled at the grace and love and tenderness and patience which had led and trained and guarded and kept poor faltering much afraid, which had not allowed her to turn back, and which now changed all her trials into glory. Then she heard him speaking again, and this time the smile on his face was almost more joyful than before. Hearken, O daughter, and consider, and incline thine ear, forget also thine own people, and thy father's house, so shall the king greatly desire thy beauty, for he is thy lord, and worship thou him. The king's daughter is all glorious within. She shall be brought unto the king in clothing of wrought gold, in raiment of needlework. The virgins, her companions that follow her, shall be brought unto thee. With gladness and rejoicing shall they be brought, they shall enter into the king's palace. Psalm chapter 45, verses 10 to 15. Then he added, Now that you are to live with me here on the high places, to go where I go, and to share my work in the valley below, it is fitting, Grace and Glory, that you should have companions and handmaidens, and I will bring them to you now. At that Grace and Glory regarded him earnestly, and there were almost tears in her eyes, for she remembered suffering and sorrow, the faithful companions whom he had given her before. It had been through their help and gentleness and patience she had been able to ascend the mountains to the high places. All the time she had been with her Lord and King, receiving her new name, and being crowned with joy and glory, she had been thinking of them and wishing, yes, actually wishing and longing that they were there too, for why should she receive everything? They had endured the same journey, had supported and helped her, had been through the same trials and attacks of the enemy. Now she was here and they were not. She opened her mouth to make her first request, to beg her Lord to let her keep the companions he had chosen in the beginning and who had brought her to the glory of the high places. Before she could speak, however, he said with the same specially lovely smile, Here are the handmaidens, Grace and Glory, whom I have chosen to be with you henceforth and forever. 2 radiant, shining figures stepped forward, the morning sunshine glittering on their snowy garments, making them dazzling to look at. They were taller and stronger than Grace and Glory, but it was the beauty of their faces and the love shining in their eyes which caught at her heart and made her almost tremble with joy and admiration. They came toward her, their faces shining with mirth and gladness, but they said not a word. "Who are you?" asked Grace and Glory softly. "Will you tell me your names?" Instead of answering, they looked at one another and smiled, then held out their hands as though to take hers in their own. At that familiar gesture, Grace and Glory knew them and cried out with a joy which was almost more than she could bear. "Why, you are Suffering and Sorrow. Oh, welcome, welcome. I was longing to find you again." They shook their heads. "Oh, no," they laughed. "We are no more suffering and sorrow than you are much afraid. Don't you know that everything that comes to the high places is transformed? Since you brought us here with you, we are turned into joy and peace." "Brought you here," gasped Grace and Glory. What an extraordinary way to express it. "Why, from the first to last you dragged me here." Again they shook their heads and smiled as they answered, "No, we could never have come here alone, Grace and Glory. Suffering and sorrow may not enter the kingdom of love, but each time you accepted us and put your hands in ours we began to change. Had you turned back or rejected us, we never could have come here." Looking at one another again, they laughed softly and said, "When first we saw you at the foot of the mountains, we felt a little depressed and despairing. You seemed so much afraid of us, and shrank away and would not accept our help, and it looked so unlikely that any of us would ever get to the high places. We told ourselves that we would have to remain sorrow and suffering always, but you see how graciously our Lord the King arranged for all of us, and you did bring us here. Now we are to be your companions and friends forever." With that they came up to her, put their arms around her, and all three embraced and kissed one another with a love and thankfulness and joy beyond words to express. So with a new name, and united to the King and crowned with glory, Grace and Glory, accompanied by her companions and friends, came to the high places and was led into the kingdom of love. Chapter 19. High Places. Grace and Glory with her handmaidens Joy and Peace stayed up on the high places for several weeks while all three explored the heights and learned many new lessons from the king. He led them himself to many places, and explained to them as much as they were able to understand at that time. He also encouraged them to explore on their own, for there are always new and lovely discoveries to make up there on the high places. Even these high places were not the highest of all. Others towered above them into the sky, where mortal eye could no longer follow them, and where only those who have finished their pilgrim life on earth are able to go. Grace and Glory and her friends were on the lowest, the beginner's slopes in the kingdom of love, and these were the parts which they were to explore and enjoy at this time. From these slopes, too, they were able to look down on the valleys below, and from that new viewpoint gain an understanding of many things which had been puzzling and mysterious to them before. From beneath they had not been seen clearly, and even then only a small part had been visible. The first thing, however, which they realized up there on the slopes of the kingdom of love was how much more there would be to see and learn and understand when the king took them higher on future occasions. The glorious view which they now enjoyed was but small in comparison with all that lay beyond, and would be visible only from yet higher places above. It was now perfectly evident to them that there must be ranges upon ranges of which they had never dreamed while they were still down in the narrow valleys with their extraordinarily limited views. Sometimes, as she looked on the glorious panorama visible from these lowest slopes in the kingdom of love, she found herself blushing as she remembered some of the dogmatic statements which she and others had made in the depths of the valley about the high places and the ranges of truth. They had been able to see so little and were so unconscious of what lay beyond and above. If that had been the case while down in the valley, how much more clearly, she now realized, that even up on those wonderful slopes she was only looking out on a tiny corner of the whole. She never tired of looking from the glorious new viewpoint on the first slopes of the kingdom of love and seeing it all from a new perspective. What she could see and could take in almost intoxicated her with joy and thanksgiving, and sometimes even with inexpressible relief. Things which she had thought dark and terrible and which had made her tremble as she looked up from the valley because they had seemed so alien to any part of the realm of love were now seen to be but parts of a great and wonderful whole. They were so altered and modified that as she saw what they extended into, she wondered at having been so blind and stupid at having had such false ideas about them. She began to understand quite clearly that truth cannot be understood from books alone or by any written words, but only by personal growth and development in understanding, and that things written even in the book of books can be astonishingly misunderstood while one still lives on the low levels of spiritual experience and on the wrong side of the grave on the mountains. She perceived that no one who finds herself up on the slopes of the kingdom of love can possibly dogmatize about what is seen there, because it is only then that she comprehends how small a part of the glorious whole she sees. All she can do is to gasp with wonder, awe, and thanksgiving, and to long with all her heart to go higher and to see and understand more. Paradoxical as it may seem, as she gazed out on dazzling vistas, so glorious that she could not look at them steadily or grasp their magnificent sweep, she often thought that the prayer which best expressed her heart's desire was that of the blind man, "Lord, that I might receive my sight. Help me to open myself to more light. Help me to fuller understanding." Another thing which gave her continual joy was their unbroken communion with the king. Wherever he went she and peace and joy went too, springing behind him with a delight which at times was almost hilarious, for he was teaching and training them to use their hinds feet. Grace and Glory quickly saw, however, that he always chose the way most carefully, and restrained his own amazing strength and power, taking only such springs and bounds as they could manage to. So graciously did he adapt himself to what was possible to their newly acquired capacity that they scarcely recognized in the exhilaration of leaping and skipping like hinds on the mountains, that had he really extended his powers, they would have been left behind completely. For Grace and Glory, who had been lame and limping all her life, the ecstasy of leaping about in this way and of bounding from rock to rock on the high places as easily as the mountain rose, was so rapturous that she could hardly bear to cease from it even for rests. The king seemed to find great delight in encouraging this, and led her on, taking longer and longer leaps, until at last she would be quite breathless. Then as they sat side by side on some new crag to which he had led her, while she rested he would point out some of the vistas to be seen from the new viewpoint. On one of these occasions after they had been up on the high places for several days, she flung herself down on the lichen and moss-covered crag to which he had led her, and, laughing and breathless, said, "Even Hinds' feet seem to need a rest now and then." "Grace and Glory," he answered, "do you think you understand now how I was able to make your feet like Hinds' feet and to set you on these high places?" She drew closer to him and looked earnestly in his face and asked, "How were you able to do this, my lord and king?" "Think back over the journey you made," he replied, "and tell me what lessons you learned on the way." She was silent for a while as she reviewed the whole journey, which had seemed so terribly long and in some places so cruelly difficult and even impossible. She thought of the altars which she had built along the way, of the time when she had stood with him at the trysting place in the valley, when he had called her to follow him to the heights. She remembered the walk to the foot of the mountains, the first meeting with suffering and sorrow and of learning to accept their help. She recalled the shock of what had seemed such a heartbreaking detour down into the desert, and of the things which she had seen there. Then their journey along the shores of loneliness, the empty cove which the sea had filled to the brim, and then the agony of disappointment and frustration experienced in the wilderness when the path once again had turned away from the high places. She remembered crossing the great sea-wall, walking through the woods and valleys until the rapturous moment when the path had turned back toward the mountains. Her thoughts turned to the precipice of injury, the forests of danger and tribulation, the great storm during which they had sheltered in the hut. And then the mist, the endless mist, and the awful moment when the path suddenly led down into the valley of loss, and the nightmare abyss of horror into which she had looked when she had thought of turning back. She recalled the descent down into the valley of loss and the peace she had found there before reascending to the heights in the aerial chairs, and of the days spent in that place where she had been prepared for her burial. Then that last agonizing ascent, and the cave where they sheltered from the floods and where she had been tempted to cast away the promises. Then the spring called Mara, and finally the mist-shrouded grave up among the peaks where she had been bound to the altar. How little she had imagined, when first she set out on that strange journey, what lay ahead of her and the things which she would be called upon to pass through. So for a long time she sat silent, remembering, wondering, and thankful. At last she put her hand in his and said softly, "My lord, I will tell you what I learned." "Tell me," he answered gently. "First," said she, "I learned that I must accept with joy all that you allowed to happen to me on the way and everything to which the path led me, that I was never to try to evade it but to accept it and lay down my own will on the altar and say, 'Behold me, I am thy little handmaiden, acceptance with joy.'" He nodded without speaking, and she went on, Then I learned that I must bear all that others were allowed to do against me and to forgive with no trace of bitterness and to say to thee, Behold me, I am thy little handmaiden bearing with love, that I may receive power to bring good out of this evil. Again he nodded, and she smiled still more sweetly and happily. The third thing that I learned was that you, my lord, never regarded me as I actually was, lame and weak and crooked and cowardly. You saw me as I would be when you had done what you promised and had brought me to the high places, when it could be truly said, There is none that walks with such a queenly ease, nor with such grace, as she. You always treated me with the same love and graciousness as though I were a queen already and not wretched little much afraid. Then she looked up into his face and for a little time could say no more, but at last she added, My lord, I cannot tell you how greatly I want to regard others in the same way. A very lovely smile broke out on his face at this, but he still said nothing, only nodded for the third time and waited for her to continue. The fourth thing, she said with a radiant face, was really the first I learned up here. Every circumstance in life, no matter how crooked and distorted and ugly it appears to be, if it is reacted to in love and forgiveness and obedient to your will can be transformed. Therefore I begin to think, my lord, you purposely allow us to be brought into contact with the bad and evil things that you want changed. Perhaps that is the very reason that we are here in this world, where sin and sorrow and suffering and evil abound, so that we may let you teach us so to react to them, that out of them we can create lovely qualities to live forever. That is the only really satisfactory way of dealing with evil, not simply binding it so that it cannot work harm, but whenever possible overcoming it with good. At last he spoke. You have learned well, grace and glory. Now I will add one thing more. It was these lessons which you have learned which enabled me to change you from limping, crippled much afraid into grace and glory with the Hinds' feet. Now you are able to run, leaping on the mountains and able to follow me wherever I go, so that we need never be parted again. So remember this, as long as you are willing to be acceptance with joy and bearing in love, you can never again be crippled, and you will be able to go wherever I lead you. You will be able to go down into the valley of the world to work with me there, for that is where the evil and sorrowful and ugly things are which need to be overcome. Accept and bear and obey the law of love, and nothing will be able to cripple your hinds feet or to separate you from me. This is the secret of the high places, grace and glory. It is the lovely and perfect law of the whole universe. It is this that makes the radiant joy of the heavenly places. Then he rose to his feet, drew her up beside him, and said, Now use your hinds feet again, for I am going to lead you to another part of the mountain. Off he went, leaping on the mountains and skipping on the hills, with grace and glory following close behind and the beautiful figures of peace and joy springing at her side. As they went she sang this song, Set me as a seal upon thine heart, thou love more strong than death, that I may feel through every part thy burning, fiery breath, and then like wax held in the flame, may take the imprint of thy name. Set me a seal upon thine arm, thou love that bursts the grave, thy coals of fire can never harm, but only purge and save. Thou jealous love, thou burning flame, oh, burn out all unlike thy name. The floods can never drown thy love, nor weaken thy desire, the rains may deluge from above but never quench thy fire. Make soft my heart in thy strong flame, to take the imprint of thy name. Canticle chapter 8, verse 6. Chapter 20. Return to the valley. The place to which the King of Love now brought them was a most beautiful valley among the peaks of the high places. The whole of this sheltered spot was laid out in quiet gardens and orchards and vineyards. Here grew flowers of rarest beauty and lilies of every description. Here, too, were trees of spices and of many kinds of fruits, and nut trees, almonds and walnuts, and many other varieties which Grace and Glory had never seen before. Here the king's gardeners were always busy, pruning the trees, tending the plants and the vines, and preparing beds for new seedlings and tender shoots. These the king himself transplanted from uncongenial soil and conditions in the valleys below so that they might grow to perfection and bloom in that valley high above, ready to be planted in other parts of the kingdom of love, to beautify and adorn it wherever the king saw fit. They spent several delightful days watching the gardeners as they worked under the gracious supervision of the king himself and accompanying him as he walked in the vineyards, teaching and advising those who tended the vines. One day, however, Grace and Glory with her 2 attendants walked to the end of the valley and found themselves on the very edge of the high places, from which they could look right down into the low places far below. As they stood there they saw a long, green valley between 2 chains of mountains through which a river wound like a ribbon of light. Here and there were patches of brown and red which seemed to be villages and dwelling places, surrounded with trees and gardens. All of a sudden, Grace and Glory gave a queer little gasp, for she recognized the place. They were looking down into the valley of humiliation itself, the place where she had lived in misery for so long and from which the shepherd had called her to the high places. Without a word she sat down on the grassy slope, and as she looked a multitude of thoughts filled her mind. Down there was the little white cottage where she had lived, and the pastures where the shepherds tended the king's flocks. There were the sheepfolds, and the stream where the flocks went to drink and where she had met the shepherd for the first time. In that valley were all her fellow workers and the friends among whom she had lived and with whom she had enjoyed such happy fellowship. Others she had known were there, too. Away on the outskirts of the village was the cottage where her Aunt Dismal Forebodings lived and where she had spent her miserable childhood with her cousins Gloomy and Spiteful and Craven Fear. As she thought of them and their wretched existence a pang of compassion and pain shot through her heart. Poor Aunt Dismal, trying to hide the fact that her heart was broken by the unhappy marriages which her 2 daughters had made, and embittered by the shameful doings of her darling son. She saw the dwellings of her other relatives, the manor house, where decrepit old Lord Fearing lived, tortured by his failing powers and his dread of approaching death. There was the house where Pride lived, and near it the homes of bitterness and resentment, and under those dark trees lived miserable self-pity. She recognized the dwelling places of those who had so harassed her on her journey to the high places, and round about were the homes of other inhabitants of the valley, people who hated or despised or rejected the shepherd. As Grace and Glory sat looking down into the valley the tears welled into her eyes and her heart throbbed with pain, 2 sensations which she had completely forgotten up there on the high places. Suddenly she discovered that her feelings toward her relatives and those who lived down there in the valley had undergone a complete change, and she saw them in a new light. She had thought of them only as horrible enemies, but now she realized that they were just miserable beings such as she had been herself. They were indwelt and tormented by their different besetting sins and ugly natures, just as she had been by her fears. They were wretched slaves to the natures which gave them their names, and the more horrible the qualities which characterized them, the more misery they endured, and the more we should show them compassion. She could scarcely bear the thought, yet for so many years she had not only feared but also condemned them, had actually disdained their misery, telling herself it was their own fault. Yes, she, detestable, fear-enslaved, much afraid, had actually dared to disdain them for the things which made them so wretched and ugly when she herself was equally wretched and enslaved. Instead of a fellow feeling of compassion and passionate desire that they might be delivered and transformed from the pride and resentment and bitterness which made them what they were, she had just detested and despised them. When she thought of that she turned to Joy and Peace, who were sitting beside her, and cried out desperately, "Can nothing be done for them down there in the valley? Must my Aunt Dismal be left unhelped, and poor Spiteful and Gloomy too, and those cousins who went so far with us on the way to the high places, trying to turn us back? If the shepherd could deliver me, Grace and Glory, from all my fears and sins, couldn't he deliver them also from the things which torment them?" "Yes," said Joy, who had been Sorrow. "If he can turn sorrow into joy, suffering into peace, and much afraid into grace and glory, how can we doubt that he could change pride and bitterness and resentment and self-pity too, if they would but yield to him and follow him? And your Aunt Dismal could be changed into praise and thanksgiving, and poor Gloomy and Spiteful also. We cannot doubt that it could be done, that they could be completely delivered from all the things which torment them." "But," cried Grace and Glory, "how can they be persuaded to follow the shepherd? At present they hate him and won't go near him." Then Peace, who before had been suffering, said quietly, "I have noticed that when people are brought into sorrow and suffering, or loss, or humiliation, or grief, or into some place of great need, they sometimes become ready to know the shepherd and to seek his help. We know, for example, that your Aunt Dismal is desperately unhappy over the behavior of poor Craven Fear, and it may be that she would be ready now to turn to the shepherd. Then poor Gloomy and Spiteful are so wretched that though they felt no need of the shepherd before, it is very possible that now is the time to try to persuade them to seek his help." "Yes," exclaimed Grace and Glory, "I am sure you are right. Oh, if only we could go to them, If only there were some way of helping them to find what we have found. At that very moment, close at hand, sounded the voice of the king. He came and sat down beside them, looked with them down into the valley so far below, and said gently to Grace and Glory, "Thou that dwellest in the gardens, the companions hearken to thy voice. Cause me to hear it." Canticle chapter 8, verse 13. Grace and Glory turned to him and laid her hand upon his arm. "My lord," she said, "we were talking about the people who live down there in the valley of humiliation. They are my relatives, you know, all of them. They are so wretched and miserable. What can we do for them, my lord? They don't know anything about the joy of the high places and the kingdom of love. There is my poor Aunt Dismal Forebodings. I lived with her for a long time, and know that she is utterly wretched." "I know her," said the king quietly, "she is a most unhappy woman." "And her daughter Gloomy," went on Grace and Glory, looking at him entreatingly as she spoke. "She married Coward, the son of old Lord Fearing, very rich, but much older than herself and a miserably unhappy and selfish creature. I believe she has not known a moment's peace since. There was talk in the valley before I came away, that he was likely to desert her. He has done so," answered the king quietly, "and she has returned to her mother in the cottage, a miserable and disillusioned woman with a broken heart. And her sister spiteful. Poor, poor soul, with her sharp tongue which makes so many enemies and deprives her of friends. She married Timid Skulking, and they are desperately poor, and have to live in one little rented room in the house of my cousin Bitterness and his wife. I cannot bear to think of their wretched condition while I live up here in the kingdom of love." "They are wretched indeed," said the king, even more gently and compassionately than before. "They have just lost the little daughter who poor Spiteful had hoped would be such a comfort to them in their dreary circumstances. And then," continued Grace and Glory with just a hint of hesitation in her voice, "there is their brother Craven Fear." She did not look at the king as she spoke, but paused a moment, then went on hurriedly. "He is the most unhappy member of the whole family. He has broken his mother's heart, neither of his sisters will speak to him any more, and he goes skulking about the valley hated by everyone." "I know him," replied the king gravely, but with just a hint of a smile. "I know him well. You do not exaggerate when you speak of his wretchedness. I have had to interfere and chastise him many times to try and correct his bullying propensities. But though I have chastened him sore, I have not given him over unto death." "No, no," cried Grace and Glory imploringly, "don't ever do that, my lord. Oh, I beg you, find some way to rescue and deliver him from himself, as you delivered me." He made no answer for a little while, only looked at her very kindly and with a look of great contentment and happiness on his face. At last he spoke. "I am more than willing to do what you suggest," said he, "but, Grace and Glory, these unhappy souls we are speaking about will not allow me into their homes, nor even permit me to speak to them. I need a voice to speak for me, to persuade them to let me help them." "I see what you mean," she cried joyfully. "We will go down with you and speak to them and show what you have done for us and what you are willing and able to do for them." "Do you think they will listen to you?" he asked, smiling at her very gently as he spoke. "No, I don't think it's at all likely, at least, not at first," she answered. "I was not at all the sort of person to make them want to listen to me. I did not behave at all lovingly to them, but you will tell me what to say. You will teach me and I will say it for you. Oh my lord, let us make haste, and go down there. When they see what you have done for me, when they see peace and joy, I do think in the end they will want you to help them too. It is because they have lied to themselves about you and have persuaded themselves that you cannot do them good that they resist you and turn from your help, but we will plead with them. Especially now, my lord, when they are so unhappy and so despised by others. Their very misery and loneliness and sorrow will make them more willing to listen to news of your grace and of your desire to help them." "True," he agreed, "that is just what I think. This is indeed a specially favorable time for us to go down and try to help them." He rose to his feet as he spoke. She sprang up too, and all four stood joyful and radiant on the edge of the high places, ready to go leaping down to the valley again. Then Grace and Glory saw that the great waterfall quite close at hand was leaping down to the valley too, with the tumultuous, joyful noise of many waters, singing as they poured themselves down over the rock lip. "From the heights we leap and flow to the valleys down below, sweetest urge and sweetest will, to go lower, lower still." Suddenly she understood. She was beholding a wondrous and glorious truth. A great multitude whom no man could number brought like herself by the King to the kingdom of love and to the high places, so that they could now pour out their lives in gladdest abandonment, leaping down with him to the sorrowful, desolate places below, to share with others the life which they had received. She herself was only one drop among that glad, exultant throng of self-givers, the followers of the King of Love, united with him and with one another, each one equally blessed and beloved as herself. For he loves each one of us, she said to herself, as though there were only one to love. The thought of being made one with the great fall of many waters filled her heart with ecstasy and with a rapturous joy beyond power to express. She, too, at last, was to go down with them, pouring herself forth in love's abandonment of self-giving. He brought me to the heights just for this, she whispered to herself, and then looked at him and nodded. At that he began leaping and springing down the mountainside before them, bounding from rock to rock, always choosing, however, leaps which were within their power to follow, and sure footholds for less experienced feet. Behind him went Grace and Glory, with Joy and Peace beside her, leaping down, just as the waters leaped and sang beside them. They mingled their voices with the joyful music of the many waters, singing their own individual song. Make haste, beloved, be thou like an heart on mountains spicy sweet, and I, on those high places where thou art, will follow on hinds feet, as close behind the heart, there leaps the roe, so where thou goest, I will surely go. The End.